You know that feeling when you're scrolling through your phone at 11 p.m., exhausted from a day of meetings and errands, yet somehow still restless and unsatisfied. You've been productive, you've been responsible, you've checked all the boxes that society tells you matter, but there's this nagging sense that you're running on empty. What happens next is predictable. You wake up tomorrow and do it all over again, but each day feels a little more mechanical, a little more like you're watching someone else live your life. You start snapping at people you care about, or you find yourself saying yes to things you don't want to do, or you catch yourself daydreaming about a completely different life during important conversations. Your authentic reactions, the gut feelings, the creative impulses, the honest opinions get buried under layers of what you think you should be doing. Jung called this the persona trap. You've built such a convincing mask to navigate the world that you've forgotten there's a real person underneath. The energy you once used for genuine interests and relationships is now being funneled into maintaining this acceptable version of yourself. Look around at your friends, your co-workers, even your family. Notice how many of them seem to be performing their lives rather than living them. The ones who exhaust you most are usually the ones who've completely lost touch with their authentic selves, demanding that you help them maintain their illusions. You can spot them because they need constant validation. They can't be alone with their thoughts, and they get defensive when you try to have real conversations. This performance costs more than you realize. Every fake smile, every conversation where you say what people want to hear, every time you ignore your instincts to keep the peace drains your psychological battery. By the end of most days, you're too tired for the things that actually matter to you, too drained for genuine connection, too depleted to even remember what you actually want. Jung understood that this isn't sustainable. Your psyche will eventually rebel through depression, anxiety, or that creeping sense that life is passing you by. The solution isn't to become selfish or reckless, but to start small by noticing when you're performing versus when you're being real. Jung's individuation process begins with simply paying attention to the gap between who you are and who you think you should be. So here's what I want to know. When was the last time you did something just because it felt right to you, not because it looked good or made sense to everyone else? You know that feeling when you walk into a work meeting and immediately switch into professional mode, nodding at the right moments, laughing at your boss's unfunny jokes and agreeing with ideas you secretly think are terrible. It's like someone else takes over your body while the real you watches from the sidelines, cringing at every performance. This isn't just social etiquette gone wrong. It's your shadow running the show while you've forgotten you're even wearing a mask. What happens next is predictable. You leave that meeting feeling drained and slightly disgusted with yourself, wondering why you can't just be honest for once. You start avoiding certain people because being around them requires too much acting, or you find yourself getting irrationally angry at coworkers who seem fake, not realizing you're just seeing your own performance reflected back at you. You begin to dread social situations that used to energize you, and you catch yourself rehearsing conversations in your head, trying to figure out which version of yourself to bring to each interaction. Jung called this the persona trap. You've become so good at being what others expect that you've lost track of what you actually want. The scariest part is that this false self isn't just a costume you put on for work. It's become your default mode, and the energy it takes to maintain it is slowly killing your authentic desires. Look around your office or friend group and you'll notice something unsettling. The people who drain you most are usually the ones who seem the most together on the surface. They're always agreeing, always helpful, always positive, but something feels off about their interactions, like they're performing kindness rather than feeling it. These are the people who can't handle disagreement, who get weird when you try to have real conversations, and who somehow make every interaction about maintaining their image rather than actually connecting. You can spot them because they mirror your energy back to you in an exaggerated way. and conversations with them feel like you're talking to a very sophisticated chatbot that's learned to say the right things, but doesn't actually understand what you mean. The psychological cost of this constant performance is higher than most people realize. Every fake smile, every suppressed opinion, every time you say fine when you're not fine creates a small energy leak that adds up over time. By the end of most days, you're too exhausted to pursue the things that actually interest you, too drained to have authentic conversations with people you care about, and too depleted to even remember what your real preferences are. This is why so many people feel like they're living someone else's life, because they are. Jung understood that the shadow doesn't disappear when we ignore it. Instead, it becomes the puppet master, making us dance to rhythms that serve everyone except ourselves. The practical truth is that this shadow puppeteer gains power every time you choose the safe response over the honest one, every time you perform agreeableness instead of expressing your actual thoughts. You can start breaking this pattern by paying attention to the gap between what you say and what you actually think, and by noticing which people and situations trigger your biggest performances. So here's what I want to know. When was the last time you said exactly what you meant without editing it for someone else's comfort? And how did that feel compared to your usual careful responses? You know that moment when you're at a family dinner and someone asks what you're passionate about, and you realize you have no idea because you've spent so long being what everyone else needs that you've forgotten who you actually are. You sit there, fork halfway to your mouth, scrambling for an answer that feels genuine instead of just socially acceptable. This isn't a lack of personality, it's what Jung called the individuation crisis, where your authentic self has been buried so deep under layers of people-pleasing that you can barely hear its voice anymore. What happens next is predictable. You give some safe, rehearsed answer about work or hobbies, but inside you feel hollow because even you don't believe what you're saying. You start noticing this pattern everywhere. In job interviews where you contort yourself to fit what they want, in relationships where you agree to things that drain you, in social situations where you laugh at jokes that aren't funny just to keep the peace. You begin to feel like you're living someone else's life, going through the motions of being a person while your real desires and opinions sit locked away in some mental vault you've lost the key to. The worst part is that this performance has become so automatic you don't even realize you're doing it most of the time. Jung understood that this happens because we've confused our persona, the mask we wear to navigate society, with our actual identity. They're the ones who can't make decisions without polling everyone around them, who get anxious when left alone with their thoughts, who seem to shapeshift depending on who they're talking to. These are the people who exhaust you because interacting with them feels like talking to a committee rather than a person, and every conversation becomes an elaborate dance around what might be socially acceptable rather than what might be true. You can spot them because they mirror your energy back to you in an exaggerated way, always agreeing, always accommodating, but somehow the connection feels hollow. This constant performance costs more than most people realize. Every time you swallow your real opinion, every time you say yes when you mean no, every time you pretend to care about things that bore you, you're bleeding psychological energy that could be used for actual growth and genuine relationships. By the end of most days, you're too drained to pursue the things that actually interest you, too depleted to have real conversations, too exhausted to even figure out what you want. Jung called this sacred selfishness. Well, not narcissism, but the recognition that you can't authentically give to others what you don't have yourself, and you can't serve anyone well while betraying your own psychological needs. The shadow, all those traits and desires you've labeled as bad or selfish, contains your trapped life energy, and until you befriend those parts of yourself instead of fighting them, you'll keep running on empty. The solution isn't to become reckless or cruel, but to start small by practicing what Jung called strategic withdrawal. taking breaks from the energy-draining demands of constantly managing other people's comfort. This means saying no to some social obligations so you can remember what you actually enjoy, having honest conversations even when they're uncomfortable, and paying attention to which activities energize you versus which ones leave you feeling hollow. So here's what I want to know. When was the last time you made a decision based purely on what felt right to you, without worrying about what anyone else would think, and how different would your life look if you did that more often? You know, that friend who calls you every time they're having a crisis, and somehow you always end up feeling drained and guilty after these conversations, even though you were just trying to help. They start by asking how you're doing, but within minutes they're unloading their latest drama. And by the end of the call, you feel like you've been hit by a truck while they sound refreshed and ready to tackle their day. This isn't coincidence. It's what Jung called the unconscious transfer of psychic energy, where your life force literally gets siphoned off to fuel someone else's emotional needs. You hang up feeling irritated and resentful, but also guilty for feeling that way because they needed support, and you find yourself avoiding their calls or making excuses when they want to meet up. You start dreading interactions with certain people because you know you'll leave feeling empty, and you begin to notice a pattern where some relationships consistently drain you, while others energize you. When someone hasn't done their own psychological work, they unconsciously seek out people who can provide the emotional stability and energy they can't generate for themselves, creating what Jung called psychological projection, where they make you responsible for managing their internal chaos. Look around your social circle and you'll notice something interesting. The people who drain you most are often the ones who seem helpless but never actually take advice, who have the same problems year after year, or who somehow turn every conversation back to their struggles. These are the people who get weird when you have good news, who interrupt your stories to tell their own, or who seem to feed off your emotional reactions to their crises. You can spot them because they rarely ask follow-up questions about your life. They don't remember details you've shared, and they have a talent for calling or texting right when you're having a good day. Almost like they can sense when you have energy to spare. Every time you comfort someone who won't comfort themselves, every time you take responsibility for someone else's feelings, every time you let someone dump their anxiety onto you, you're giving away the psychological fuel you need for your own life. This is why you feel exhausted after certain social interactions, why you procrastinate on your own goals after dealing with other people's drama, and why you often feel like you're living everyone's life except your own. Jung's principle of compensation explains why this creates a vicious cycle. When you overgive from your false helpful persona, your shadow compensates with growing resentment and passive-aggressive behavior, which makes you feel guilty and give even more to prove you're still a good person. The practical truth is that most of this energy drainage happens through what Jung called unconscious agreements. Unspoken contracts you made, often in childhood, where you learned to manage other people's emotions in exchange for approval or love. You can start breaking these patterns by paying attention to how you feel before and after interactions with different people, and by practicing what Jung would call sacred selfishness, protecting your psychological energy like the finite resource it is. So here's what I want to know. When was the last time you said no to someone's emotional dumping session because you needed to protect your own energy? And how different would your relationships look if you stopped being everyone's unpaid therapist? You know that moment when you're sitting in your car after another soul-crushing day at work, staring at your house where you'll go inside and pretend everything's fine, and you suddenly realize you can't keep doing this anymore. Not the job, not the relationships, not the constant performance of being someone you're not. It hits you like a wall. Either something has to change drastically, or you're going to spend the rest of your life feeling like you're slowly suffocating in your own routine. This isn't a midlife crisis or burnout. It's what Jung called the psychological death that has to happen before you can actually start living your real life. What happens next is both terrifying and liberating. You start saying no to things that used to feel mandatory. You stop returning calls from people who drain you, and you find yourself canceling social obligations that you realize you never actually wanted to attend in the first place. People around you get confused and sometimes angry because you're not playing your usual role anymore, and you feel guilty but also strangely energized, like you've been holding your breath for years and finally remembered how to breathe. You start having conversations with yourself that you've been avoiding, admitting things you didn't want to face, and feeling emotions you've been numbing for so long you forgot they existed. The scariest part is that you don't know who you'll be on the other side of this process, but the current version of yourself feels so fake that the unknown starts to seem preferable to the familiar prison you've been living in. Jung understood that real change requires what he called the death of the old self. Not literally dying, but letting go of the identity you've built to survive and please others, even when that identity has become a straitjacket that's slowly killing your spirit. This withdrawal phase isn't depression or antisocial behavior, it's the psychological equivalent of a butterfly dissolving in its cocoon, messy, uncomfortable, but absolutely necessary for transformation. Look around at the people in your life and you'll notice something interesting. The ones who get most upset about your changes are usually the ones who benefited from your old people-pleasing patterns. They're the friends who only called when they needed something. The family members who expected you to manage their emotions. The co-workers who relied on you to do their work without credit. These people will try to guilt you back into your old role because your transformation threatens their comfortable arrangements, and their resistance actually confirms that you're on the right track. You'll also start noticing people who seem genuinely happy for your changes. These are usually the ones who've done their own psychological work and recognize the energy of someone reclaiming their authentic self. The most surprising thing about this process is how much energy you suddenly have available once you stop using it to maintain false relationships and personas. All that mental power you were burning trying to keep everyone else comfortable becomes fuel for figuring out what you actually want, pursuing interests you'd forgotten about, and having real conversations instead of performing social scripts. You know that feeling when you're standing in your kitchen at 7 a.m., making the same coffee you've made 1,000 times before, following the same routine that's supposed to make you feel productive and normal. But instead you catch yourself staring out the window wondering if this is really all there is to your life. It's not just Monday morning blues or needing more caffeine. It's that quiet voice in your head asking whether you're actually living or just going through the motions of being alive. This moment when you realize you can't remember the last time you felt genuinely excited about anything in your daily routine is what Jung called standing at the threshold of the transcendent function. The psychological crossroads where your conscious mind finally starts paying attention to what your unconscious has been screaming at you for years. What happens next is both terrifying and oddly liberating. You start questioning everything you took for granted, like why you chose your current job, whether your relationships actually fulfill you, or when you stopped having opinions that weren't influenced by what other people might think. You find yourself having conversations with friends and realizing you're saying things you don't really believe, agreeing with opinions that don't match your gut feelings, and making plans you have no genuine interest in keeping. The most unsettling part is catching yourself mid-sentence and thinking, who the hell is talking right now? Because the words coming out of your mouth sound like they belong to someone else, someone who's been carefully crafted to please everyone except you. You start noticing how automatic your responses have become, how you laugh at jokes that aren't funny, comfort people who drain you and say, "I'm fine," when you haven't felt genuinely fine in months, all while a voice in your head keeps asking uncomfortable questions you've been avoiding. The energy vampires in your life aren't necessarily bad people. They're just people who haven't done this psychological work, so they unconsciously rely on your energy to maintain their emotional equilibrium because they've lost touch with their own authentic core. This constant performance costs more than you realize. Every time you bite your tongue when you disagree, every time you say yes when you mean no, every time you pretend to care about things that bore you, you're bleeding psychological energy that could be used for actual growth and genuine connections. By Thursday of most weeks, you're running on fumes, not because you're physically tired, but because you've spent so much mental energy maintaining a version of yourself that serves everyone except you. Jung understood that this energy drain isn't sustainable. Your psyche will eventually rebel through anxiety, depression, or that growing sense that you're sleepwalking through your own life while everyone else seems to be living more authentically. The people and activities that energize you versus the ones that deplete you aren't random. They're giving you information about who you actually are underneath all the roles and expectations you've accumulated over the years.